Hi there, welcome to another episode of the Bonsai Stuff podcast. It's me, Scott Martin, and I just wanted to start this podcast with a thank you. Thank you to everyone for the support. It's been great, whether you've booked in for a workshop or a course with me, or a workshop with a club that's running something for me, or whether you're purchasing something online or you're just getting in touch. It's really nice to know that there's a lot of support out there for what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, which is great. So it's very good. Thank you very much to the bonsai community all around the world. It's been awesome. So this podcast, I want to start with completion from the last episode, which was talking about my time in Osaka. And just some brief summary tips that I picked up, which were pretty important and pertinent to how I look after my bonsai to this day. So I thought I'd just break those down. There's a few points there, and then I want to start talking about something which is really important and something that I use quite common as a great technique in bonsai development, and that is the changing of the repotting angle of a tree, no matter what stage it's at. It's something that can be used, and I want to delve a little bit more into that and just get everyone thinking. Possibly you've been through repotting season, but where we are in Melbourne, Australia, we're on the verge of heading towards our autumn period and then winter, and then we get into repotting at the end of the winter period or later in the winter period. So it's something that you can start putting thought into now and prepare for it, and maybe make sure that your bonsai takes that next step. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So when I finish one of my trips, one thing that I really like to do is to reflect and make notes and try and summarize things, and any particular little tips or tricks or important processes that I really may have written notes about, or I may have just had it discussed with me. I try and make sure that I jotted them down, and so I came home with these books that are just full edge to edge of my ramblings. And this one section that I came across after I'd finished the last podcast was Mr. Fujikawa's tips. And this sort of blended into, it started as what had been told by Mr. Fujikawa, but then it blended into sort of everything that I'd picked up on that trip. And I thought, wow, that's a really nice way to summarize and sort of put it all together in one nice, neat little bundle to sort of wrap up that trip for me. And some of the things, as I was looking at them, I go, yeah, well, I do that now. I do that sort of every time I work on my trees, no matter, how old they are, how young they are. I do that, and it's like, well, that's where you picked it up, mate. That's where that's where this information came from. It's like, oh wow, that's amazing, because I found that things sort of start to blur together over time, and you just start doing things instinctively, and it becomes second. It's like muscle memory. When you do something, an activity, you do it long enough, then that becomes the default of what you do. And it was actually really, really interesting. Put a smile on my face to make me think that, oh yeah, that's where that one came from, and that's why you do that sort of thing these days. So anyway, one of the first things that I picked up, one of the most important things that Mr. Fujikawa told me was that one of the keys to success in bonsai is watering. And that's nothing new, and we all sort of go, oh, that whatever. But it's so true. And once that got put in my head, that seed, I suppose, I sat back and I watched and I made notes on when a professional bonsai nursery was watering, and accurate details of how they did, and followed them around and asked questions, said, why this one? Why that one? Why not this one? Why did that one get it and that one didn't? And so one big note that I've written down in my notes and circled afterwards, after the trip, was I think I don't water enough in summer. because I was there in their summer period, and the routine would generally be get there first thing in the morning, go and check everything and spot water with a can. If anything's dried out overnight, spot water it, but don't necessarily get into watering everything straight away. Then at 10 o'clock, like routine, everything was watered, thoroughly watered, like really, really thoroughly watered to have water gushing through those pots. A couple of hours later, at 12 o'clock, everything was spot checked again. So walk around, anything that's dried out would be watered with a can, but not automatically watered. Then 3 o'clock on the knocker, everything was watered thoroughly. So it's that sort of 5-hour window between waterings, thorough waterings, with spot watering in between. And then again, an hour and a half, 2 hours later, between 4 and 5 o'clock, everything was spot watered. So it was really highlighted, I suppose, that during the summer period you can't turn your back on it. And it was after that trip that I suddenly put a lot of thought into my watering system that I use, an automated watering system, because now I'm a full-time bonsai professional, so I can be around the trees whenever I need to be. But that's not the same for everybody, and it's definitely not the case for me when I have to travel or be away from my trees. So I need to have something in place where I can make sure that the trees get the water that they need when they need it. And it was really that light bulb moment going, you can't just go, I'm leaving for work at 7 in the morning, right, I'll water now, and I get home from work at 6 o'clock at night and I'll water then, and in between they'll be right. That's okay, because that's just not how it works. It's not up to us. It's not up to what our schedule says with watering. It's purely up to the tree, and it takes the water as it needs it, and if it's not there, then there's a consequence. How severe that consequence is it's that varies, but there is a cost, there is a consequence. So that was one of the big things I learnt there. Another one that I learnt was about the 5-year cycle. So everything sort of starts small, compacted, designed nicely, then it starts to grow and grow and grow, and over a 5-year period, things start to elongate and start to get too long, and you need to be pruning them back, and not necessarily redesigning, but you need to compact the silhouette of the bonsai. And what I do, and I think what everyone does that has trees that are sort of getting down to the more refined side of things, is that instead of waiting 5 years, you start doing it every year. As things start to get too long, you start cutting them back. But the point that was being made was that the most important part on your bonsai is not the outside silhouette, it's the inside inner buds. And the only way that you can maintain those inner buds is by making sure that light and air gets in there so they can continue to grow. So it's definitely not a hedging process where we're keeping the outside of the bonsai looking great. It's about doing things in our processes and our maintenance and care for our bonsai that ensure that those inner buds flourish and stay alive. And so it means that when we do get this 5-year cycle, or the extension of the outer silhouette, that we've got something that we can cut back into. And like I said, that is something that I will do every single time that I have a bonsai in front of me, whether it's mine or someone else's. It's okay, so this is starting to get too long. I always think about it and go, well, okay, what's behind this on a branch? And if you've got a juniper branch, for instance, that's got really long branch and you've got foliage right on the very end of it, and that branch is quite old, well, the chances of actually getting budding back further are very, very slim. Very slim. It's not something that you can rely on with the structure and design of your bonsai. So it's almost to the point where you've got to start saying, well, okay, that branch is gone. Somewhere in the future, this thing's got to go, because I've got nothing behind where that foliage is right at the extension of the branch. So, okay, then I've got to start thinking with my design, that branch is gone, it becomes a gin. What can I put into that position? Is there something back further on the branch to the left or right of it that can be then wide as that grows to fill that void that was there? And that was that definitely gets done every time that I work on trees. So it was the 5-year cycle was another one. The second was talking about wiring and thinking about the where you want to bend a branch and how you want to move and position a branch using wire as the technique, and depending on where the branch is going to go determines which way that wire has to come around the trunk and hit that branch, and whether it's going over the branch or it's going underneath the branch, what's the directional movement of the wire. You can't have it where the wire is coming from the left and the branch is going to bend towards the left, because that creates a buckling of the wire. So the wire comes around the back from the right-hand side, the branch moves to the left, and as it goes to the left, that wire that you've used tensions and holds firmly in place. And it was like, geez, so easy when you see it. And to think about it and be having it reinforced every second of every day. Every time you work on a tree, it's like, no, you've done it wrong again there. That's why your wire's gone sloppy. It's like, but hang on, when I first put it on the tree, it was on nice and tight and it looked great. And it's like, yeah, because the branch hadn't moved then. As soon as you move that branch, you're going back from where the wire came from. Therefore, you're making it sloppy, you're loosening the wire, therefore you lose the connectability, which means that it's not going to do its job. It's like, okay. So it was that trial and error of learning it time and time and time, and that muscle memory that I talked about before, that these things come into play all the time now. And I'd much rather spend an extra 10, 20 seconds thinking about, okay, I'm wiring this branch, I'm wiring this tree, but what is it that I want to achieve? That's the most important part. And I picked it up every time I went and studied. It was, okay, what do you want to do with it? Don't just put wire in there and go, I don't know. It's okay, well, where do you want this branch to go? What's the most effective way that you can get it to that point? Is it wiring it from around the back of the trunk to come to here? Is it then, maybe using a really heavy wire? Or is it by putting on a lighter wire and then using a guy wire to bring it down, because that's the most effective way to do it? And this stuff all came from seeing these professionals in this high-end environment where maybe it wasn't something that they even thought about. It's like, for me now, I don't think about it, I just do it. Whereas for me, seeing it with fresh eyes at that time, I remember, and like I said, this last minute notes that I wrote, generally it's at the airport or on a plane on the way home. It's like, what are your learnings from this? What can you take home and change? Like, because you're not going to do one of these trips and walk out and go, yeah, it was a great holiday, I loved it, saw some beautiful trees, see you later, and go back to exactly what you're doing. It's like, well, how do I get those building blocks to keep getting more and more advanced? And the wiring was definitely one of them. And things like I've drawn pictures of having we started talking about wire pitch. How do you want to bend the branch, and and also positioning of the wire, to think about, you want the wire on the outside of the bend, so therefore you're gonna support that, rather than having the wire on the inside of the bend and then breaking on the outside of the branch. So it was there was a lot of talk about wiring. And another one I picked up was working with pines, which I'd done a lot, and it was reinforced to me, which I knew already, but it's really nice to see it at two different nurseries that do these things to the highest of their game. Was when you work with pines, work from in and under, never coming top down on the needles because of the damage you're going to do. It's working underneath and coming up and out. So that was a nice one for me. One of the big ones that I picked up from in Osaka was it was reinforced about the movement and flow of the tree, and whether it's with the initial direction of the trunk, or whether it's as a counterbalance against the initial movement of the trunk. But it was, I've drawn lots of pictures of the apex of bonsai, and where should the highest point sit, and which is the compacted side, and which is the elongated, which is the longer side of the apex to indicate the movement of the tree. And then from that point down, where do you position the branches, and where are they compacted and where are they extended? Where is their negative space, and all that stuff. So there's a lot in the design of the tree, and also about hiding the neck of the top of the tree. So, your apex, your dome, for want of a better word, sort of comes down to a certain point on the trunk, and it hides away the neck of the trunk. And I really liked that as a design feature, and it was something that sort of I implemented far more after that trip, and it was always in my thought process. It was like, okay, so I've designed this tree, I've got the branch here, I've got this, I've done that. All right, so now get to the apex. All right, so we've got the movement, we've got the position of the highest point. Is that is it conflicting, or is it flowing with what I'm intending to do with this tree? All right, so now start bringing the foliage down and covering the neck, because it creates a nice silhouette, and you suddenly go from being left and right structure on your trees to this dynamic movement where they're forward and they're back, and there's depth and there's structure, and it's nice. It suits what I like in bonsai. Then we talked about so when I'm going to talk about branches and positioning as opposed to height of the trunk of the tree. And one of the big things that you've got to consider when you look at making a bonsai from scratch, it's like, okay, well, it's the nabari. So it's the base roots, it's the trunk. What does the trunk look like? Where should that sit? But it's also, okay, well, how high do you want this, or how tall do you want this bonsai to be? So if you want it to be, 1.5 meters tall, it's very different branch placement as opposed to if you want this to be 30 centimeters or 20 centimeters tall. Let's say it's a little showing that you want to keep as a small tree because it's got a beautiful squat little trunk. Well, if you use a general guide, then you've got to have branches very low on a showan compared to a taller tree. It's very rare that you'd have a branch, just off the nabari if the thing's over 1 meter tall, because it just doesn't fit with the structure of the tree. I've got that. That's why I don't use these as rules. I use them as guidelines because I think they're, you can make a really interesting tree by not following the standard design, and I'm not encouraging that, but I'm not saying that's what you have to do. You don't have to go, well, Scott said if I'm making a tree that's 1 meter tall, I won't have any branches below 30 centimeters. Cut them all off. It's like, no, you've got to work with the material that you've got, and you've got to use your artistic flair to create what you want. But as a general guide, and that's all this is that, you generally, I've got to be very careful how I say this because I don't want to force it to be a global change in how people think about their trees. But generally, if you look at a photo that's come from an exhibition and find a small tree that you love, and I'm not really one into categories of the trees and making sure that they comply with the categories based on their height. But if you look at a small bonsai, then generally, and you love it, and you go, yeah, that's the perfect one for me. All right, then start looking and go, well, why do you love it? What's not that you're going to replicate it with your design, but what features of that tree excite you or get you interested? And look at the branch height. Look at where the first branch sort of starts on those trees, and you might find that it's there's a little bit of trunk showing, and then the first branch comes out on one way or the other. And that's something that I picked up from this trip. Was branch positioning on small trees, and keeping in mind that you may pretty much need more branches down lower on your tree. So before you go lopping things off, think about height of the future tree, and also pad heights. Like thinking about the depth and volume. The smaller the tree, really, the smaller the pad size has to be about this proportion that we want with our bonsai. So when you look at a photo, you should find it pretty hard to tell whether it's 10 centimeters tall or it's 1.5 meters tall. It's got to be all about this proportion for me anyway. So that was something that got talked about as well. So rather than just bull at a gate blazing at these things, tearing things off, it's like, okay, well, just stop and think about it. Another one was pad positioning. There was so much to learn from this trip, and I'm trying to nut it down in a few minutes, but the pad positioning if you've got a straight branch on a tree, a juniper or something like that, it's rather than extending in the same direction as that branch, you might put a little bit of movement in there, not spaghettiing the branches, but you might put a little bit of movement in to bring that branch and the pad back around a little bit to hide away that straight nature of whatever that branch is. I learned a long time ago, good structure is good bonsai. So it's not something that I would do long term with my trees, this spaghetti and movement of the branches, but you can create nice depth there with the pad being slightly in front of the branch, not to make something that what it isn't. And I'd always look to get growth further back on those branches that I could prune back to, that would improve the structure over time. But it's a nice technique that's used to hide straight branches. And one of the big ones that I use all day, every day, is when I'm working with any bonsai, but particularly, let's say it's a juniper. Because that's what I've been working on a hell of a lot lately is junipers. And first thing that we do is, rather than working silhouettes and shape of pads and structure, it's clean underneath. Let's get rid of the stuff underneath first. So whenever I come across a pad, first thing I do, go in there, look underneath, clear all that downward growing stuff, because it's useless. There's no point making a nice silhouette and everything looks pretty, and then going, okay, now I've got to thin it out because I want to make sure I get sunlight in there for those inner buds that I learned about when I was in Osaka. So you go and do the thinning process, and then suddenly you go, oh, hang on a minute, I haven't cleaned underneath the pad. So then you go and do the cleaning process underneath the pad, and you go, well, now I've taken off too much foliage, because what I thought was thick because it was, it looked like it was dense and sunlight couldn't get in there. That's no longer the case, because this crap that's growing underneath the branch has to go, and I've taken off now too much foliage. So I always start with that elimination process and make the profile underneath beautiful. Anything that's growing down slightly downwards, whatever. I'm not thinking about getting a downward growing branch and wiring it back up so it fills my pad up. It's because I know that this will happen naturally over time. So it's remove that downward profile, and then start the second part I'll look at is when you look at, say, a juniper, and this was again shown to me in Osaka that I use now all the time, is I remove the weak growth. So anything that's spindly, and you'll know if you've got junipers, you've got a Shimpaku juniper, then you'll look at there's certain branches which are really nice, and their tufts of growth are really strong and really compacted and really dense. Then you'll come across one that's weak and spindly and long, and but I really need a branch to come out of that area, so I'm going to keep it. And then year on year, this thing never gets stronger. It never gets a nice head of growth, and it's just a waste of resources for the tree. So I go through, I clean the pads underneath, and then I start removing the weak growth. And there were two things that were shown to me, because before that point, I would be, I need that growth. I need it. It's like, it's never going to do anything. And at the time, I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure it will. It's like, years and years later now, like every time I look at it, I think that's the same. Year on year, this stuff is never going to get stronger. So stop wasting your time, stop wasting the tree's resources, just get rid of it at the start and push the growth, push the resources to what you want more of, rather than having parts of it be wasted going to something which is never going to fulfill its supposed destiny in the back of your mind. So they were the big ones that I'd picked up when I was in Osaka, which, like I said, it was something that I'll never forget. And like I said, it's really interesting for me now that what has become muscle memory, what has become common practice, what has become part of my day-to-day life, with looking at all sorts of bonsai from all sorts of people and all sorts of places. It's really common that I go back to. When I looked at these notes, I went, that's so cool. That's where this came from. That trip that I spent over there in the stinking heat, where I was sweating buckets, was all from that point. And yeah, it's good memories. One of the other memories I'd written was that on the last day, or the second last day before I left, when I'd bought all these pots, and I'd take my backpack along, and don't forget I had to ride a bike, and I don't know how far the bike ride was. I think it might have been a couple of Ks or something like that, a couple of kilometres. It wasn't too far. It was long enough to, and it felt like it was with a backpack full of pots, and the front basket wrapped up with pots in bubble wrap as well, heading back to my bike my bike park to get to my accommodation. As I felt like I was carrying about 30 kilos on my back, riding this bike in 150% humidity, high 30 degree temperature, which I was just absolutely sweating buckets. I remember getting off the bike after all this ride and finally carrying these pots, going, God, none of these better break as I go through customs. These things have to make it home in one piece, because I reckon I've just lost about 4 kilos in sweat and body mass just riding back to the bike ramp. So it's things like that I know that I'll never forget. And this, like I said, just another great adventure of mine in the entirety of my bonsai life. Okay, so one of the things that I really like is dynamic flow of the structure of your bonsai. And what I don't like, if it's not a formal upright, I'll qualify what I'm about to say. What I don't like is straight, and it's something that I try and avoid as much as I possibly can, unless I'm not going to say it again, but unless it's a formal upright, then obviously straight has to be part of it. But and I don't necessarily profess to following design categories of trees, because I think that as I said earlier, I think that you have to work with what's placed in front of you, and you shouldn't have a little picture in front of you saying, okay, well, which one is this going to be? Is this going to be informal upright? Is it going to be slanting style? Is it going to be this? Is it going to be that? Because then you're making the tree something that it's not naturally inclined to be. And I think that you can take what a bonsai is naturally inclined to be based on how it's grown, and you can perfect it, right? Rather than twisting it and forcing it to be something that's not. I think you can hone in on what it's got, and you can make it better than what it would have been on its own. And again, I won't repeat this, but for that very reason, I don't like windswept style, because I find that it's very hard to, and they look contrived, and they don't look like something that I would naturally see when you see a very healthy tree that's got these branches growing to the right that are then arced around growing to the left, and everything's pushed around that way. Because it's like if the wind was howling that hard from the right side, and it was growing to the left, that branch would never would have grown in the first place. Or if it did, it would have had a bend that was smack on the trunk. Like it's not something that all of a sudden, trees growing a certain way, and then all of a sudden the wind decides that, hey, I'm going to come 300 k's an hour every single day of this tree's life from the right side now blowing to the left. So that branch that was growing out to the right is now looping around to the left. So anyway, I'm not going to repeat it. But what I do try and avoid is straight. So that's whether it's vertical or whether it's horizontal. I think that we can improve on that. Those straight lines, this is my personal opinion, those straight lines can be distracting when you look at a beautiful tree. Let's say it's the lower part of the trunk that's dead straight. It's going straight up, and then above that there's a bit of movement towards a branch. Maybe the trunk's been cut, and then a branch has been turned into the future apex or leader of the tree, and then the movement starts and goes to one side of the structure. Now that's great, but the straight part, that's the lowest part of the tree, would be to me very distracting. And if the trunk, sort of goes up straight and then goes at a right angle, across the vertical, across horizontal from the vertical, then that to me would look really, really weird. And one of the techniques that, well, I was going to say tricks, but it's not a trick, it's a technique. One of the techniques that we've got is to change the angle of the bonsai when we repot. And that's something that I use all the time. It doesn't matter how old the tree is, whether it's coming out of a nursery pot or whether it's been a bonsai in a pot for 20, 30, 50, 100 years, whatever it is, it's definitely something that I consider. One of the considerations you have to take into account when you're doing this is the nabari of the tree, because let's say visually we're tilting the tree to the left. The nabari that's on the base roots that are on the right-hand side of that trunk will lift up. The roots that are on the left-hand side, the nabari on the left-hand side, will suddenly drop below soil level. So if you've got an old tree or a bonsai that's got it's a vertical straight trunk with a beautiful, nice spreading nabari, then possibly your angle of adjustment when you're repotting isn't going to be drastic. It's not going to be a 45-degree turn to the left. It's going to be maybe a couple of degrees just to make that straight, that dead straight that we've got, just off a little bit. it takes it from being as distracting for someone like me to look at, or possibly yourself too, that you can adjust it slightly by moving just a little bit. Maybe it's 5-10 degrees, whatever it is, just so you avoid that dead straight. So the root system that pops up that's exposed, you've got to take great care of that, right? So you've got something, or live roots, which have then been lifted out of the soil area. So you're going to have, rather than having a dead flat initially when you first do this move, rather than having a dead flat root ball that's been worked nicely, that you've raked and looked after for years, suddenly one side is going to be higher than the other side. So what you need to do is take care of it. And some of the things that I do with it is to create little pins. So I'll take possibly 3mm aluminium wire, and I'll create like a nice little sharp U with it, and I will cut the ends of that wire on an angle with my wire cutters, so it creates like a sharp U-nail type effect. And then, the length of it might be, depending on the size of the pot and how strong you want it to be, but it might be around, 2-3 centimeters in length, something like that. And then I use those pins to push down those roots that are starting to stick up in the pot to hold them down and in place. So it allows the roots to then continue to grow back into the soil, and then they start to get firm over years and hold themselves. So I use pins to push down the roots that are exposed because I want to protect them and keep them alive. I don't want my nabari to eventually dry up and die and then be cut off. So the pins definitely help hold them down, and they're only temporary. They're you might find after 6 months of being in the pot you can remove them. It might be that it's a year, 2 years, depending on the rate of growth of that root ball. But those pins do work really well. The other thing that I use, other technique, is to put chopped up sphagnum over those exposed roots to help keep them moist and wet, and to encourage them to continue to grow. So it provides like a protection layer. I do sphagnum moss over my root base anyway when I do repotting, but it's something that I'm definitely very conscious of with those roots that are growing up. So pin them down, make sure that you get sphagnum moss, which can be removed over time to slightly expose more roots and therefore create more nabari or the surface roots that you'll see. The other side, which is being pushed down, you need to try and bring those roots up to the surface again. So rather than hiding them and having, a beautiful bonsai with a lovely trunk with roots on one side of the tree and nothing on the other, you want to try and bring that other side up. And you do that by mounding the soil underneath that side of the pot, underneath those roots, to then tilt them up. It pushes them up. So you can imagine that when you put your pot's a dead level, horizontal plane. When you put your drainage layer in there, that's fine. That's dead horizontal. But then the next layer, which goes over the drainage layer, is tilted. So you've got one side of the soil mound that you're about to put this tree onto is higher than the other, and that high side is the side that you're tilting towards. So picture this. So the tree's tilting to the left, so the soil mound will be on the left-hand side of the pot. So it's higher on the left-hand side, which means that those roots that are tilting down will then suddenly push back up towards the surface again. And it's a really good technique to sort of squish it down and make sure that you're getting those roots to lift up on that side of the pot and bring them back up to a normal level. So that's one of the ones that I use. And when I tie the tree in, obviously I use a 4-way tie-in, which means that the wire then runs around the outside of the tree. It doesn't run across the front of the tree or the back of the tree and touch on the roots. But I always make sure that one of the first ones that I put in is on that side that's being pushed down, because it'll want to spring the tree back up and because I want to bring those roots back up on that side and make sure the wire goes across on that side to hold them firmly in place. So the other thing that you've got to consider too and this is regardless of whether it's a change of angle, but when you're positioning your bonsai in the pot, you've got to be really careful about the position of that root ball inside the pot. Now that means left and right, but also front and back. You've got to take into account that when we're tilting the tree, let's say to the left, the movement could be to go to the left or it could be go to the right, but you can position your bonsai slightly off center to exaggerate or force directional movement as well. So if it's tilting to the left and you're counterbalancing to the right hand side with your branches and apex and structure and flow of the tree, then you can position the tree slightly to the left hand side as well to sort of force it back to the right hand side. Now you've got to be really careful that horticulturally the roots then get compressed on the side that you move towards, so there's less room for them to grow. So just be mindful that if you do shuffle to one side of the pot, that you do it and still leave enough room for those roots to grow. Don't push it hard against the edge of the pot, because those roots will start wrapping around the pot straight away, and you'll find that side of the root ball will become weaker over time than if it was more balanced into the center of the pot. And same front and back. Really, it's one of the ones that you should be looking at anyway, is to try and center the tree. And if there's something prohibiting that from happening, thick root, whatever it is, then over time you should gradually reduce that down so you can get good, even spread of the root system when you're repotting. It's one of the things that we can use. So the big tip is avoid straight. One of the great ways we can do it with a thick trunk is by changing the repotting angle. If it's a very young tree, then let's say it's a whip or whatever, then you can start the process very early where you're wiring that whip and you're making the bend from the soil level. Don't make it part way up. So get your wire in nice and deep into the pot and make your bend right at the base, at the nabari, where you're starting to move the tree. Don't let it go straight up. Don't try and fix a problem later on. Try and avoid it in the first place, if that's what you want, if that's what your go is. So it's just something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because as the trees come across the bench and I start working on them, I look at them and start shortening the growth, start looking at those inner buds, and possibly looking at things that annoy me with the tree. Like if you look at it and go, there's just something about it, or I'm thinking, hey, maybe this would look better like this, and you start chocking something under one side of the pot or the other. It's like, okay, well, yeah, angle change would be great, because then the tree suddenly changes form and structure, and suddenly goes from something which is maybe annoying me or not doing it for me, to something which I'm like, yep, that's it. And then I've got to start looking at it going, okay, well, to get that kind of a movement, I've got to adjust the repotting angle of this tree. Can I do it? Look at the surface roots. Is there an issue? Is that something that I can do? Because it's all well and good. You see a demonstration where a tree's in a massive black pot, and they get it up on stage and they tip it over, and it's down on its side, and it's a full cascading tree. It's like, that's awesome, but that nabari, every root that's growing vertical, how are you going to keep that alive? Like, how do you take that root system now that's laying on its side, where the roots are growing straight up? How do you bring that down? It's not that it can't be done. It's just that it takes time and diligence. There's one tree I'm thinking of particularly, which I was involved with, which was a raft. It was a juniper that had beautiful growth on one side, and this fella's customer said to me, hey, I really want to make a raft. And it's like, well, that's the perfect candidate. It's like, okay, so then how do you get that root ball when you lay that tree flat down on the ground and start to get those roots growing, and you start coming up with, various trunks to form like a raft forest? How do you protect the roots, and how do you keep it so it's interesting, and how do you make it live? And it was just done slowly over time using the pin technique that I talked about earlier. It's done with sphagnum moss over the top, but it's also every time that you're repotting it, you're starting to work that root ball away and starting to build the strength of the lowest part of the root ball, and reducing the reliance on the top part. And the top part that's there, trying to force it down over time and gradually, so it's not quite so vertical. But anyway, repotting, change of angle, something that we can definitely use. And if you're looking at trees that maybe there's something about them that you don't like, well, it's a great one to suddenly change and then force a bit of a redesign and restructure, and maybe put a bit more of that dynamic movement into the structure of the bonsai. Well, that draws us to the close of this podcast. It's been an interesting one. It's really, like I said, it's like therapy for me to go back through these notes and look at stuff and get a greater appreciation, I suppose, for everything that I've learnt and piece by piece. And there's some more trips to Japan coming up that you'll hear about as well, and just maybe won't be as in depth as the last couple, but there'll be definitely some learning points in there which we can all use and apply and take snippets of and improve what we are as human beings, looking after these beautiful beings, these trees that make us so happy, and it'll be informative and hopefully it'll keep us smiling at all and keep you enthused and branch cutters in hand and looking at your bonsai maybe a slightly different way. That's definitely what I hope for. Is I do hope for joy to come from these podcasts, and it seems to be hitting the target, which is awesome. It's like I said at the start, it's really nice to and warms the cockles of my heart to feel the love out there from the bonsai community, because it can be daunting sometimes. You put your neck on the line doing stuff like this, and you're not sure of how it's going to be perceived. And I'm to the point where I'm pretty comfortable in what I do and who I am and the place that I hold in the world and those that are near and dear to me. So it's really nice to know that there's a real positivity out there in the world of bonsai. So thank you again. I'm not going to ramble on too much, and keep listening out for the podcast, because as you would have gathered this year, they're coming thick and fast. So I'm really enjoying them, and there's so much on the agenda to talk about that it's going to be interesting. So stick around, and thank you. And until next time, which won't be too far away, happy bonsai.